All right, guys. So this week, what we're going to do is starting to look at rendering. So, but I don't want you to get hung up on the idea of Revit rendering as sort of this whole big unit that we're going to do. I really just want to give you an introduction to the Revit rendering environment, so that in the future, whenever you encounter it, if you encounter it, you'll be a little bit familiar. Okay. So I'll show you how to apply materials, how to set the environment settings and stuff like that, but I won't really go like to the fullest extent of showing you how to create these amazing, wonderful renderings. Okay, so I just want to be very clear about that. And we're not even going to deal with lighting or anything like that, because Revit lighting is really in depth. So we're going to stick to an exterior environment. We're going to look at that. First things first, I think what I want to point out to you is the Revit view settings are basically kind of all-inclusive. So we can look at what our building is going to look like while it's rendered right here in the view. So if you go to down here in the bottom left corner or type in VV, you can change, or not in VV actually. Yeah, I guess you can do it in VV. But anyway, the visual style right here. You have the option of switching it to consistent colors or realistic, or possibly even ray trace. I actually don't really use ray trace. I don't think Revit's very good at it. But if you switch it over to realistic, what you're going to see is all the renderable materials. So right now, if we rendered this thing, this is essentially the material mapping we would see. We would see some shingles, we would see some wood patterns. The rest of it is just going to be this generic blank. And you can see the CMU has some color to it, and that's fine. But so we need to kind of collect and apply a number of different materials here. And I'm going to start with a few of the materials for the building, and then I'm going to give you guys some time to explore how to actually capture some materials to use for other elements. The first thing I'm going to do is show you how to apply the two main building materials. So I'm going to show you how to apply the siding, and I'll show you how to apply some plaster material. If you look really closely, you can see that it's sort of, well, it doesn't really communicate up here, but it's got this tiny, almost barely visible texture. It's not the end of the world. You could use something like that, but generally you want something with more relief because it's going to show up a little bit better than the standard materials. So do you guys know what I mean by relief? Okay. So an example of relief, you guys can find these materials in here in the resources folder for this class under textures. Siding is a great example of a material that has relief. So if there's a shadow being cast by the material, that's called relief because it's simulating depth. It doesn't have to actually have depth, it just needs to simulate it. Similarly, this other siding, I think it's pretty much the same thing. It's a lower amount of relief, right? Plaster materials, on the other hand, if you have something like this, it has a lot more relief because it's casting more shadow because the texture of it is deeper and more defined. So that's the plaster we're going to use for this. All right, let's take a look at actually applying the materials. So the easiest way to apply the materials is to just go into Edit Type. Well, actually, let me preface this by saying you can completely modify and generate any material by going to Manage and then opening up the Materials panel right here. And it might take a minute to load because the materials in Revit are kind of a heavy operation. And you can go in here and you can modify any of these materials at your whim, whenever you want, totally absent of actually having an object selected. The way that I find myself working most of the time is to select the material I want to edit and then edit it. So I can just go to Edit Type, edit the structure, and I can change my materials, or I can select the material that I want to change right here, exterior plaster. And it'll kind of jump me to that location. Okay, so it's up to you guys how you want to manage that. I just find it easier because I oftentimes have to jump into the structure menu anyway to know exactly what the material name is. So why not just open the material property there? Okay, so let's get a greater understanding of what happens here in the appearance panel. So this is a little different than how we've been modifying elements and copying and creating duplicates of elements since the beginning of this class. So basically, if we need to create a new wall type, we duplicate it, we rename it, and then we just, change it to whatever we want, right? The only thing that defines one wall type from another is its name. And then you can change it and it'll have different properties. Materials, the rendered side of materials is different. They have these things called attributes, I think is what they're called. Is it attributes? Asset. Dang. So anyway, they have these things called assets, and what that really is it's kind of like a label for the material's visible quality. So think of an asset as like a type, kind of like a wall type, but it's for materials, the renderable materials specifically. So anyway, what we have here is an asset that's called gypsum board painted white. If I wanted to change this, I would duplicate this asset. I could replace it too, but let's just duplicate. So now it's called gypsum board painted white 1. How do I want to preface this? Well, anyway, let's start off by changing the name. So, so you change the name in the information panel, and if we want to call this, let's pretend we just want to create another gypsum board panel for now. Why is this? Why is that a gypsum board material? That's weird. Well, let's call it plaster. And we're just going to call it tan. It's probably more like an eggshell or something fancy like that, but we'll just call it tan. Description as generic material is fine. The color that you see here is not necessarily related to the image. So let's look at the image first. So basically the image here has the ability, if you click on the link below it, you have the ability to replace that image. So when I go to the textures folder, copy the location, go in here, paste the location, let's drop in plaster. Our plaster is actually white, but we can change this color to whatever we want. If we wanted to make it kind of like an orangey color, we could do that. It won't change anything on the actual material. Let's go back to like a gray. All right. So you can do some like fading and stuff on the image so that it blends in with some of the material color behind it. Whoops, my bad. Appearance. There we go. So let's change that again back to like a tan thing. And let's pull that image fading down. And you'll see that as I pull it down, the color of the block is starting to look more and more like the color that I selected. Does that make sense? So think of it like a base coat and a top coat. If you put a really thick, saturated base coat, and then you put a really thin top coat on, you might see a little bit of the paint behind. Does that make sense? All right. So I'm just going to leave that maxed. Yes?
So you're saying color is the base coat and the image is the top?
Yes. Okay. Correct. All right. Glossiness is something that you can define for a number of different things. Oh, I need to replace the material again. Whoops. Plaster. There we go. So glossiness is specific to certain glossy materials. So if you have like a shiny floor, you can bump up the glossiness. For now, we're going to leave plaster low at 0. And don't worry about highlights so much right now. You can do all of the same stuff that you do on other rendering engines, where you can bump up reflectivity, transparency, stuff like that for glass or for like chromatic materials, metals. If you want to give it some self-illumination, you can actually make the thing shine. But we don't need any of that for ours. Now, bump is interesting. Bump allows you to create and cast extra shadows. What you need to know about bump is that a bump map is not just a material map. Actually, let me do this. Properties. Copy that. Let's jump down to, what was that material called? Finishes, gypsum board. Where's finishes G? Oh, I went to flooring. There we go. So the bump looks a little different than, oh, hey, that's weird. Their bump is the same. Oh, sorry. I'm thinking of a normal map. All right, let's scratch that. Don't worry about using bumps. You could just leave it at the standard bump. For us, I guess, if we want to, since it is the same, let's switch the bump as our material. I'm too used to using other rendering engines. All right, so we put the plaster material in there and we have some bump. You can do less bump or you can do more bump. Well, you'll see the difference when you actually get into rendering it if you want to play with that. I'm just going to leave it at 0 actually. Well, I'll leave it a little low actually. Something like that. Okay. I guess you could do a color tint. I never really use color tint. So anyway, that's exterior plaster. Hit OK, hit OK, hit OK, and you'll see that that material now shows up in our rendered condition. Okay, so that is incredibly important to know that the realistic view is going to be your rendered view. Now this isn't a great texture map, but we're going to use it for now. If you need to change the scale of the texture map, go into Edit Type, go to your Material, Appearance, and Edit Image. Okay, Edit Image is where you define what the scale of the element is. And you do have the ability of kind of changing the dimensions rather easily. I can either disassociate the two sides and I can make them different sizes. So I can make like plank sort of conditions out of square maps. And then I can take rectangular maps to make them square. Generally, guys, it's not a good idea to manipulate the proportions of your images. You kind of want to create a texture that's going to have the right properties for the material that you want to map it on. Okay, that's just a general rule of thumb. So I leave that connected, and I can just say I want every square of this to really be, let's say 3 feet, right? We're going to pretend that we want it to be like really pronounced and really big. Don't worry about position right now. Position is something that's kind of relative to like an ACT panel system, where if you have a drafting pattern on the material when you're looking at it in hidden line view, you might want to actually line up that pattern with your renderable pattern, because like you position it in a specific location, but if you're also rendering that view, you need them to align between the two. Okay, that's what that does. Don't worry about anything else. For our purposes, we won't really need much. So hit OK. Okay, now you can see that that texture has jumped up in size. Any questions so far? Okay, so I'm going to pause for a moment on this one, and then I mentioned position, so I'm going to develop a material next that we're going to have to utilize that position feature.